Repair Center. I'm Nancy Ramsay, the director of the Soul Repair Center located at Brite Divinity School on the campus of TCU in Fort Worth. I welcome you to our webinar series that is co-sponsored with the Volunteers of America Shea Moral Injury Center that's directed by Dr. Rita Nakashima-Brock, Senior Vice President at VOA and founder and former director of the Soul Repair Center here at Brite Divinity School. The Soul Repair Center seeks to provide resources for religious leaders, VA and military chaplains, and civilian professionals who support veterans and their families. This series provides information in areas of interest that are under-researched or for which information is not easily available, but helpful. Today's webinar provides a much-needed opportunity to hear from two scholars with military experience whose publications bring a new interpretive frame for thinking about military moral injury. We have the opportunity today to hear from them and explore with them the difference a societal frame makes for understanding moral injury and responding to those affected by it. Our speakers are the Reverend Joshua T. Morris, Ph.D., a bivocational scholar, practitioner, and veteran. He offers courses in the area of spiritual care. He also serves as a pediatric staff chaplain and as a chaplain in the U.S. Army Reserve. He publishes and speaks on the issue of military moral injury, and he recently published with Lexington Books, Moral Injury Among Returning Veterans, From Thank You for Your Service to Liberative Solidarity. The Reverend Michael Yandell, Ph.D., serves as senior minister at First Christian Church Disciples of Christ, Greensboro, North Carolina. He's an MDiv graduate of Brite Divinity School and holds a Ph.D. from Emory University. Michael is a retired U.S. Army veteran who served in Iraq as an explosive ordnance disposal specialist. He is the author of multiple essays related to moral injury and of a forthcoming book with Lexington Press, War and Negative Revelation, a theoethical reflection on moral injury. Following their opening presentations, I will moderate an opportunity for them to be in conversation with each other. And then around 3 p.m. Eastern, I will pose your questions from the chat. I want to remind you that in approximately 10 days to 2 weeks, the link for a recording of this webinar will be accessible at this site under the box titled Forthcoming Webinars. And now you'll see a box that says Previous Webinars. I want to thank Sam McAllister, the skillful production staff person from VOA, who is assisting us today, and Dr. Rita Nakashima-Brock, who will moderate the chat. So with that, I want to turn our attention to Joshua Morris. Josh, take it away.
Well, good afternoon. First, I want to thank Nancy, Rita, and Sam for all the amazing work to get this off the ground. That is more work than I'm able to do. So I'm really appreciative of that. And I also want to thank Michael, not only for being in conversation and engaging my work, but for what his friendship has meant to me these past couple of years in the veterans and moral injury space. Now, the Soul Repair Center is actually where I wanted to start with my remarks today. So in 2014, I was a younger Army Reserve chaplain preparing to deploy to Afghanistan. At this point in my career, I had read Soul Repair. I had read the now canonical Brett Litz et al. Article, and I was ready to go. I thought I understood what moral injury was. So I come home in December of 2014. Quickly in January of 2015, I attend a Soul Repair and Moral Injury Conference in San Diego. So recently I went back to my notes to see what I gathered from that time, and my notes say that it was one of the first workshops. I don't know if that's true, if my notes were correct, but regardless, I am really honored and humbled to be continuing in conversation with the Soul Repair Center all these years. So in 2015 is also when new conversation partners started to emerge and develop in my own thinking. It helped me to push moral injury beyond what I was already thinking and what I was learning. So it was through cultural studies and critical theory, and in particular, the work of Antonio Gramsci and Stuart Hall, that I started to think about moral injury from a broader, more societal perspective. For me as a caregiver and a chaplain, moral injury always provided the language that named what I was witnessing in counseling. Also, crucially for me, when I was coming home, moral injury in the literature helped me explain my own experience and the anticlimactic nature of what it meant to come home as a reservist. So when I came home, I was somewhat detached, somewhat dejected. So as a reservist, I needed to go back to my job, right? So I quickly go back to being a hospital chaplain in Southern California at a community hospital. I try quickly to re-engage with the relationships, re-engage with family and friends. I tried to go back to normal civilian life. However, it was through my own experiences and in the experiences of counseling that something seemed off. So building on this, it was watching what it meant to come home, experiencing what it meant to come home in a reserve component capacity where I was seeing people sort of fall through the cracks. A gap was emerging for me when I saw that I wasn't sure if these people were covered in the literature. So my own thinking started to expand, right? I needed new people to help me talk about these things. So in other words, something was missed or something was missing that isolated the moral injury experience in either an individual pathology or an organizational construct of the military. For me, no matter how important those individual counseling competencies were, if it doesn't critique for me the broader social and cultural implications of reintegrating with the experience of moral injury, I wasn't sure how much it was going to be able to do. So for me, once again, a challenge of returning to civilian life after my overseas combat deployment was reintegrating into a society that was uninterested, or at least unwilling to acknowledge the full psycho-spiritual or spiritual impact of war. So it's my contention from a societal framework level that civilians, people, can exacerbate moral injury through our collective inability to reckon with and process our collective society's role in war. So even as we have left those wars, so in August of last year, the national discourse was talking about what it meant to leave Afghanistan after 2 decades. But it was hard to talk about that because these conversations were still shrouded behind words like freedom and terrorism and victory. So with that, I want to take the remainder of my time today to think about this, what I'm going to call almost a liturgical phrase in US parlance: thank you for your service. Now I pause here, as I always do when I talk about this, to say thank you for your service is not the problem. I'm not saying you should stop thanking veterans. So if you log off before you hear anything else, know that if gratitude is important for you as a way to show your appreciation, continue to do that. But what I am saying is that thank you for your service becomes a symptom. I am saying that after 2 decades, thank you for your service seems to work inversely. That if we were truly grateful and if true gratitude was behind thank you for your service, I would hope that these wars would have been ended sooner and we would have come home a lot quicker than 2 decades. I end that quote there with what is needed are the proactive next steps of support, and we'll get to that. So I see thank you for your service manifesting through 3 themes from a societal perspective. 1, it is fueled by and it is ignited by ideology. 2nd, that it ripples through relationships. Now, the relationships I would talk about, you might assume would be family relationships, relationships with our kids, our spouse, our friends. But what I am interested in, especially in a reserve capacity of what it means to come home and go back to work and live life, is what happens in those employer-employee relationships, those class relationships. And then 3rd, I actually think this framework, the societal framework, in expanding the way we think about moral injury, actually helps us understand this whole phenomenon outside of a military context. And yes, that it's outside the scope of what we're doing today, but I think what it does is it helps a turn as we come back to military war injury, especially as caregivers, that we would have new competencies, that we would think about intersectionality and mutuality in new ways to be able to provide care. So ideology, what in the world am I talking about when I talk about ideology? So it's important to sort of start with a working definition. Now, even implicit in the word working definition is that there's not really an agreed upon definition of this is what ideology is. Michael and I even have different strands of thought of who we rely on when we talk about ideology. But for me, when I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking about this strand that goes all the way back to Marx and Engels. Now, I have problems with the way they define it. So like any good math problem, I have to show my work. So even though I'm relying on, Antonio Gramsci and Stuart Hall, I still have to like name the lineage of where we're coming from. So my working definition is a set of beliefs that determine social behavior. So it's the way we sort of rationalize inconsistencies within our worldview. It's the way we make sense of things. And when I think about this, the big thing about ideology is that it's contradictory. It sutures lines of arguments and agreements in a way that is not going to always make sense. And I hope that's clear on this slide. And most importantly, there is no outside of ideology. And that's been my main problem with the old school ideology critique, is that there comes this moment where you're enlightened and you can step outside of ideology, but that in itself is pure ideology. So that's my big statement right there on the slide. Moral injury reintegration. It's complicated enough, right? But what I want to say is that it's further complicated within a cultural ecosystem steeped in an ideology that mythologizes military service. So when I think about this conversation from a societal perspective, a societal framework, the dominant ideology, the way we mythologize veterans and war, maintains this fantasy that anything that we are involved in, we as in the United States, is moral. And therefore, the service members, the veterans, the soldiers that engage in those things are either, as Zachary Moon says, they're either heroes or they're head cases. So that ideology creates a pretty strong binary. And once again, as I mentioned a couple of slides ago, what happens to those who fall through the cracks? So then my question for us as we think as caregivers is, how does our ideology prevent us from truly welcoming veterans home? And then how is ideology manifested in this conversation? So you can see the pictures on the slide here, almost like a case study, right? You see that massive 100-yard flag at an NFL game. You see players from various sports kneeling for the national anthem. So a conversation that starts in 2016 with Colin Kaepernick kneeling in protest to police brutality in Black and brown communities. He's told he needs to stand up because people died for that flag. They died for that national anthem. So then as 2020 happens, we get through the initial lockdown of COVID-19, when sports start to sort of slowly reemerge. It's at the same time in the summer of 2020 of the George Floyd murder and many other murders of unarmed Black and brown bodies throughout the country at the arms and hands of the police. So when sports reemerge, that becomes a major part of the reemerging. So when LeBron James takes a knee for Black Lives Matter, he is told to shut up and dribble. But when Drew Brees, another quarterback, when he says he can't support that, he's told that he is allowed to have his opinion. Now you might be thinking, okay, Josh, I don't really see what this has to do with moral injury. For me, what becomes important in these conversations is how the veteran is used. How the veteran, for me, becomes a pawn in the way we think about military service. So for me, when ideology sets the discourse, right, for how a veteran is received, only one type or a binary type of veteran is accepted. So that's important for me to think about of how do we think about our veterans and how do we talk about them from a broader perspective, because that's how they're treated. In other ways they're treated, which moves into my second point, is how they're treated in relationships. So there's a lot of amazing resources out there about how to provide care for families, spouses, children, friends, Ph.D. advisors, people who love a service member who deploys and then comes home, and what that reintegration experience is like. And so I'm not going to talk about that stuff because other people are already doing it. But what I think is important to think about is, what does it mean to come home and then to go back to work when you're confronted with thank you for your service, how it manifests in that relationship. I wasn't expecting this when I was doing interviews for the book. I wasn't expecting class relationships to be a thing that would come up in most of my interviews. And that's because the veteran was sort of understanding themselves as a neoliberal subject. That what matters is no longer who they are as a person, what they offer society, but as a subject, as a neoliberal subject, we'll say, what becomes their existence is what they can produce. So one veteran in one of my interviews, he's talking about what it was like the first time he went back to work. The first time he's meeting with his supervisor again. And this is what he says. I'm going to quote him. He says, "My boss said we lose staffing all the time when you guys leave the country. We don't have our people. You soldiers are always gone. It's either your monthly drill or some schooling or another deployment. You volunteer for this, you volunteer for that. Many of you, quote, straight up lazy dudes," end quote. So why this is important to me as a caregiver, as a veteran, is because one of the internal logic of thank you for your service, of support the troops, is that the way we extend our appreciation is by ensuring that the job that you put on hold to deploy would be there when you get back. But what I want to say is it's not always that simple. It often conflicts with other dominant ideologies. So yes, I know that within a reserve component that there are laws, right? That the type of job, the pay that you were receiving by law has to be there when you get back, of course. But what I'm saying is it's more complicated than that sometimes. So what happens for employers when thank you for your service bumps up against other ideologies? The ideology of the bottom line, right? It is the economic realm rather than a social realm that determines our existence. So what became very clear to me in those interviews was that employers who are driven through competition or productivity to increase profits have little room for military service in a reserve context. It's far easier to support the troops, right? When those troops are somebody else, when they're active duty, when they're not impacting your bottom line. So once again, a crack emerges where people fall through the cracks. There's a gap of care, those individuals who are bumping up against how society receives them as a veteran. But in that story, it's some other veteran. We thank them for their service. So there's a conflict between ideologies, one of supporting the troops and one of rampant, atomized neoliberal capital. And that moves, I think, really easily into how we can think about moral injury outside of military. I'm not the first person to talk about this, but what I was surprised about now coming on 2 years ago is thinking about moral injury as we were dealing with the pandemic. So I'm going to read a long quote, which I know is not the best way to present, but as I read this quote, I want you to think about the past 2 years and the images that you see on the screen. Maybe for you as a caregiver, what you have experienced in your different roles. So here's the quote. "I am terrified. I'm seriously considering whether I can keep working as a doctor. I may be okay. I'm young and healthy, but I can't bear the thought of infecting other patients with a disease that could kill them. And that is the risk without proper PPE. It's terrifying. It's indescribable. This is not seasonal flu. This is a new virus with greater mortality we know much less about. I'm losing faith in leadership, medical as well as political. It doesn't look like there's a plan. We had weeks, I'm going to add, we had years to prepare, and we're still running out of PPE. And clearly, doctors, healthcare workers are expendable. Why sacrifice us when there aren't enough of us as it is? How many of us will still be able to work when the right time finally arrives? They're throwing us into the slaughterhouse. That is what they are doing. So that's from The Guardian. Obviously, in hindsight, as we read that quote now in January 2022, we would read that quote a little differently now than we would have in March or April of 2020. But when you think about moral injury research and you think about Jonathan Shea, that is what is going on in this quote for me. It is the lights are going off. There's been a betrayal of what is morally right by someone who holds legitimate authority in a high stakes situation. What is more high stakes than you determining who gets a ventilator, who gets PPE to respond to these things? And it's right there. I'm losing faith in leadership. Key individuals, right? Whether that's hospital administrations, city administrations, state, federal, all the way up. So what happens? The feeling of feeling expendable. And how do we connect this back to thank you for your service? Early in the pandemic, what was going on is at the end of the healthcare workday, so around 7 p.m. or 5 p.m., people would gather outside, they'd gather on their balconies, they'd bang pots and pans, and they would essentially thank healthcare workers for their service. And as someone who works in healthcare, I know that the nurses and the doctors and the respiratory therapists and the people that are in this every day are appreciative of that. But we think about that now in 2022 of what are the ways that that stuff can start to ring hollow. If we are appreciative, why are we still dealing with these things in the ways we are within our culture, in our society? The debates that sometimes can be more than a debate, can be violence as we think about wearing masks, vaccination mandates, the way people think about things. And the levity comes sometimes on Twitter. And when the CDC recently released what they wanted to say was the new guidelines of when you could return to work, Twitter was all over it. So the CDC now says you can run with scissors. CDC guidance says thoughts and prayers really do work. CDC says when you've reached the center of a Tootsie Pop, your quarantine is over. People are starting to recognize that betrayal goes all the way down. And we can see behind the veil, and it seems as though the things that we think that society is doing, sometimes it seems as though we're on our own. So with that, I want to pause and pass my time to Michael.
Thank you, Josh. Sorry, I'm just getting something on my window set up better. My windows, excuse me. I just want to say I'm grateful for the invitation to be here. I'm grateful for Rita and Nancy to help bring me up as a young scholar. I'm thankful to Josh as well for his friendship. For the many conversations we've had at different conferences, and looking at the participants gathered, there's many other conversation partners in there to whom I'm grateful and whose work has really influenced my own. I'm just happy to be here. I apologize, I don't really have speaking voice normal today. I'm coming off a case of COVID myself, and Josh's last comment really resonated with me, the frustration with shifting guidelines and various institutions having widely different messages. But again, I'm grateful to be here. I'm grateful for the technology we have. And with that, I'll jump into my own remarks. So I want to take us back a while, actually back in the day, to 9/11 and to George W. Bush's comments that evening of 9/11. George Bush said at the beginning of his speech that thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. And then he closed his speech claiming that we would go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and all that is just in our world. So that's what he said on the evening of 9/11. And then I want to take us way, way back to the 3rd century, share with you a remark from one of my favorite theological conversation partners, Origen. Origen on goodness and justice, something George Bush talked about much, much later. Origen said that if a virtue is something good and justice is a virtue, then undoubtedly justice is goodness. Just as we call evil and injustice one and the same wickedness, we should hold goodness and justice to be one and the same virtue. So Origen was arguing with other ancient thinkers who would distinguish goodness from justice. In his view, they misunderstood these concepts. I'll quote one more time from Origen. For they think that justice is to do evil to the evil and good to the good. That is, according to their meaning, that one who is just will not show him or herself well disposed to the evil, but will behave towards them with a kind of hatred, end quote. So the interrelatedness of goodness and justice is central to my work. Justice is goodness. I agree with Origen, where justice is a mode of goodness. And in my view, the machinery and the logic of the global war on terror these past 20 years, what I describe as anti-life in my work, this logic of the global war is built on a kind of hatred for the other, a skewed vision of justice. The individual warfighter is not where this hatred resides, but the hatred is actually baked into the past 20 years of US foreign policy put forth in the global war on terror. Moreover, moral injury does not reside solely in the individual, but permeates a nation that has been oriented toward the other with a kind of hatred. In this way, my work has points of connection with Josh's, in that we both attempt to unveil and address and critique harmful ideologies, where we talk about ideologies with different conversation partners. I'm talking about an ideology of war that we're all drowning in. And I think individual warfighters described as the morally injured, or perhaps just the first to realize this. As caregivers, we may think we stand on the shore and are able to throw a line out to the morally injured individual drowning in despair. But in reality, we are all far from the shore. Moral injury is a broad social concern. And when the social implications of moral injury are not recognized, the despair of morally injured individuals is exacerbated. The social framework matters because any conception of moral injury that focuses only on individuals is woefully incomplete. It leaves the individual to drown and allows most of us to deceive ourselves into thinking we stand on solid ground. On the topic of ideology, I don't want to get too lost in the weeds of my own conceptual work, but I do want to say I find Josh's use of Marx and Engels Ramsay and Stuart Hall compelling, especially Stuart Hall on media. And Josh uses a really compelling example of American Sniper as a case study on media and ideology. And I also appreciate Josh's work on ideology as a mythologization of military service. I use ideology more in the sense to describe the logic of the global war on terror itself. In my own work, I borrow concepts from Karl Barth, Paul Tillich, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and Hannah Arendt to construct my own theological concepts, which aren't necessarily germane to this webinar. But I will share a few remarks on Hannah Arendt that are relevant. In her work on totalitarianism in the 20th century, Arendt talks about ideology as a kind of movement. A movement from a first premise to a demonstration of that premise. The demonstration justifies and proves true that first premise. While there's more to say about that, I apply Arendt's work on ideology to the US global war on terror in this way. The idea of defense and security dependent on a perpetual enemy. That idea is devoured by the perpetual process and logic of preparing for and engaging in war. Let's put it another way, in Bush's words, going forward to defend all that is good and just in our world becomes a movement in history, manifested as a 20+ year global war on terror. And going forth in war to secure goodness and justice, we prove over and over again that there is an enemy. The first premise of the enemy forever justifies our movement to eradicate the enemy as a good, disguising that our justice is a kind of hatred. I argue in my work that anti-life or an ideology of war becomes manifest in our history through the military framework of full spectrum dominance in the 21st century, from a unique conception of US sovereignty in relation to the sovereignty of other nations, and in a broad, far-reaching social assumption of US moral superiority in relation to Iraq and Afghanistan. Our so-called enemies are never seen as moral equals, but rather as terrorists, insurgents, radicals, on and on. And these terms all cement the ideology of perpetual war. The moral equality of both sides in a conflict is central to just war theory. It's the notion that both sides believe they're fighting for the right. And I believe that idea of moral equality has been thoroughly discarded. So why does this matter? Josh describes in his book a posture of accommodation. And to kind of paraphrase, kind of quote him, most work on moral injury has attempted to address moral injury from within the ideology, that is, from a posture of accommodation that never critiques the ideology. In my work, I define moral injury in probably too short a way, too pithy a way, but in two parts. Moral injury is a despair of oneself, and moral injury is a despair of one's world. In the midst of this despair, I build a phenomenology of negative revelation. That's why it's in the title of my book. The warfighter is an agent in the project of defending freedom and all that's good and all that's just in our world. Begins to recognize that goodness and justice are not actually present in that project. There's a revelation of absence and a longing for goodness and justice whose meaning and content has not yet been revealed. following this negative revelation through my two-part description of moral injury. Moral injury as a despair of oneself alludes to previous work on moral injury that addresses the very real and very critical emotional and spiritual needs of the individual. As a theologian, I draw on Paul Tillich's work to describe this despair of oneself as a sense of meaninglessness. It is for the individual as if goodness and justice, that which one has hoped and endeavored to defend, have been emptied of their moral contents. The goodness and justice and how they've been framed in our moral world, in hindsight, appear as a great deception. This is a deep theological betrayal. And that's a betrayal that Josh describes also in a unique way in his own work and case studies. Moral injury is a despair of one's world, addresses the societal framework we're aiming at today. The individual feeling of meaninglessness, the revelation of the absence of goodness in the War on Terror's project, extends to a society whose posture toward the world, whose moral tapestry of goodness and justice is enmeshed with an ideology of war. Someone whose work got me thinking along those lines is Joseph Winnicke-Leiden's article entitled Moral Injury as Inherent Political Critique. I actually think the title was longer than that. I don't have it right in front of me, but it's worth a Google. So the individual is caught up in moral injury in two ways. She needs a way out of despair, a way forward to virtues of goodness and justice with a moral content that isn't dependent on a kind of hatred. She is also caught up in moral injury in that she perceives our moral world in a way that few others do. Attempting to address one part of the moral injury, the despair of one's individual self, while insisting that the moral world that's built on war, in which the individual exists, is still meaningful, becomes a meaningless endeavor. Again, I use the analogy of one who drowns and a caregiver aiming to throw a line from the shore. Often the caregiver does not stand on the shore, but swims in the ideology in which the morally injured person drowns. The morally injured individual has experienced and knows that we cannot swim forever. Eventually, we'll all drown. She has not ventured out into this landscape of defending goodness and justice and lost her way. She recognizes that the way itself is lost. There's a parallel here to Josh's concerns over the recent shifts within military chaplaincy over the duration of the global war on terror. One of the functions of chaplaincy is as a force multiplier. There's a pressure, there's been a growing pressure on chaplains to get folks back in the fight. Even outside that concrete example, there's a presumption that the person suffering from moral injury can somehow be rescued, that her place in a tacitly accepted moral convention that's built on an ideology of war can be restored, that she can experience healing in an atmosphere that she has come to experience as toxic. This is not the case. For folks who provide care to veterans and for the wider public, a broader frame that acknowledges the ideology in which we are all swimming suggests that our work on moral injury is a work of mutuality, relationality, and interdependence. The individual warfighter has learned that we've never stood on a shore of goodness and justice, but that we're looking forward and toward it with longing and hoping that we might reach it. caregivers and others ought not to hold her in place, but to try to see that new place to which she's pointing and try to find their own way there alongside her. And with that, I've seen a couple things pop in the chat. I did want to, some questions about that article I mentioned. It's Joseph Winnicke-Leiden's Moral Injury as Inherent Political Critique. And again, I think I'm dropping part of the subtitle there, but maybe that's been answered in the chat. And with that, I hand it back over to Nancy.
This becomes an opportunity now for Josh and Michael to be in conversation together. And I'm first of all going to invite you to respond to each other. What did you hear that you wanted to ask the other to elaborate upon? Or where did you hear places where your work coincides or maybe clashes? If you start off that way, then I'm glad to come back in with some of the points from the chat. But first of all, I want to give you the priority to engage each other where you were intrigued and excited.
Thank you, Nancy. And thank you, Michael. That was really amazing. My first question, as I'm thinking about for you now as a pastor, and me as a chaplain and caregiver of like, not what can we do then, but I mean, can we avoid, or what does caregiving competencies look like in the midst of drowning? Maybe is the pithy way to say it. I like that you said pithy, so I'm going to join you in the pithiness.
That's a good question. I don't think I have a full answer other than just in the past year or so, as having started a new trajectory as a pastor in the middle of the pandemic. I've come to an awakening that it's not that I want to throw all the previous academic work I've done in the garbage. I still very much stand by it, but I've realized I've often got lost in the abstract and being with people, getting to know about their lives, being around them regularly, has made me think more about my own very sharply. Oops, that's my timer for me to stop talking. I guess I did okay.
Good.
Yeah, it's made me reflect more on the kind of sharper critiques I've made about the war, about foreign policy, and how it's easy to lob those things out in solitude when I'm typing, but in conversation with folks who have vastly different experiences. I found it much more effective to bracket some of those sharper critiques in the beginning of a conversation. But curious what you think about that, Jim.
Yeah, I pretty similarly, actually. There has to be, and I'll share the story. So when I was doing my dissertation defense, I talked about like the radical nature of listening to stories, and a member of my committee, you kind of pushed back and was expecting that the radicality I was talking about to be something more than the act of listening to a story. And the way I think about that now, years removed, I still want to go back to what happens when we listen to people's stories. It doesn't have to be just civilians or pastors listening to the stories of veterans, but I think it goes both ways. I think if we can allow ourselves, like the mutuality that you spoke of, I think is a way to start. That when we start to listen to stories in the way, and we don't like tokenize the experience of what it means to be a veteran or what it means to be a healthcare worker, like, and on down the conversation, that I think if we allow ourselves to be changed by those stories, my hope, maybe in my own idealism, like when I think about this is that hopefully this would help us vote differently, spend our money differently, do church differently in a way that, because now that we're out of these wars, what does our short-term foreign policy look like for veterans, and service members? Like, yeah, we might be out of this. I think if we pay attention to the news, I'm not sure how long we'll be out of conflict. And so that ideology of war, how does it continue to perpetuate, and how does it perpetuate at home? It's January 12th, so last week was January 6th. And how do we think about how the ideology of war how it has come home? It's always been home, but now this spotlight has shown how it really is home in different ways. So that's where I would start.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I had like three things I wanted to ask you about, Josh. So I'm trying to decide which is, I think the one, and I'm an advantage here because your book exists. It's a great book. Mine does not yet exist. So I've had the luxury of being able to read Josh's work before this. And it's very compelling. But there's a question that you actually ask within the work. How can a military chaplain within a hegemonic institution of the military industrial complex still maintain the interests of their service members? I just thought that's a heck of a question, and wondered if you had an initial answer to that.
Yeah, it's a heck of a question, and I don't know if I have. I'm not sure if you're convinced by the answer because we've talked about this last week, but I think to say a religious caregiver should be aligned and concerned with the well-being of their parishioners, or for military chaplains with veterans, I don't think that's a new thing. So how are we using our power and privilege to use like liberation theology language? Like, how are we influenced by and therefore changed in solidarity with the communities we serve? I think military chaplains are at, I'll say, an advantage. Sometimes it feels like a disadvantage because you're living in this trauma, but we are hearing these stories. I'm curious in your thought on this, because as a pastor, sometimes it says my internet is unstable. It doesn't say I'm unstable. Might be, but therefore, like we are living this life in the trenches, so to speak, and so therefore we cannot help but be changed by living that life. So therefore, the next step after thank you for your service, the next step out of that gratitude is to change things. And I think that religious leaders are within traditions that have sought to be a prophetic voice to change these things. I know it's difficult in the military as chaplains are commissioned officers. And so there is a lot of power and privilege to be able to say, we're going to challenge the military industrial complex after 20 years. Like, that might be unreasonable, but if we're not even willing to try to be prophetic, then it seems like we're just golfing buddies with the Pharaoh. Like, we're not doing anything to change the well-being of those that we care for. So that's my first thought. I don't know if you're, what do you think?
Oh, good. I thought that was a great first thought. I just thought I'm so glad you raised that question in your book, and I thought now would be a great time to. Yeah. I felt like it really gets at the heart of your project, and I wanted you to be able to speak to it here. I hope it didn't feel like a curveball.
No, not at all.
You asked me something about how I felt about it as a pastor. You were kind of cutting out there, but I was just thinking, this is a much lower stakes thing I experienced, but I'm in a church, it's quite progressive, but we have an American flag in the sanctuary. And I've been here a little over a year. I'm trying to decide when I want to make this a big deal and whether it's the big deal I want to make, but to talk about, because it's one of these things, right? Like, thank you for your service. It's the presence of the flag means a lot of different things for the folks in the congregation. But I do want to trigger some kind of deeper conversation about that, why we feel we need to have it. And that's such a lower stakes environment than being in a chaplain relationship with a veteran or with an actively serving service member. But it's one I'm finding I'm very hesitant to kind of dig in my heels and sort of suggest, like, maybe this doesn't belong for these reasons, and this is why I think so. So I'm just, I think how I relate to that, it's a much longer conversation that needs, as a prerequisite, a lot of rapport and a lot of trust.
Yeah, well said on rapport. I agree with that. I'm going to try and flesh this out. So when you talked about Hannah Arendt and the idea of ideology, I'm wondering what you think about within our own borders. So in the United States, do you see her logic continuing with the way that we are not just creating enemies overseas, but those enemies are now in our own border? And how do you see just the recent shifts or the recent threat of violence within the United States? Whether you want to use the word civil war, like how do you see her argument? How helpful is that for us here on this side?
That's a heck of a question too. Thanks. That's a
softball question.
Yeah, that's I was using her work initially. I was reflecting back 2001, 2002, when I'm not saying there was 100% like support, but there was broad support for this war across political lines, yellow ribbons everywhere. There was just this huge outpouring of support for this. And it was in those moments, I think, that this ideology started to move forward. And those in power were able to, I don't want to get too far, but certain folks in certain positions were able to use that momentum to kind of move an ideology forward that sort of takes over. That even their own administration and following administrations find it very difficult to get out of. The ideology sort of devours everything. Now I think it's still applicable here in different ways, and that she talks a lot about the manipulation of the masses. And I don't mean to say, I'm not trying to throw stones here and say people are ignorant or stupid, but there's I think we're all subject to deception. And so she has a lot to say on the manipulation of the masses, on the promotion of cynicism and distrust. And that's the way in which I think she's applicable here.
Yeah.
And I'd say more if I could consult my notes on her. She wrote a lot. Yeah.
I think you're spot on, though. In this quote from your paper, you say, "We prove over and over again that there is an enemy. The first premise of the enemy forever justifies our movement to eradicate the enemy as a good." disguising our justice that is a kind of hatred. I think that's just so spot on for what we, the way these conversations usually go about this stuff. So I think your use of her is so great. So yeah, thanks for your answer.
Thanks. Do we have time for, I think I'll ask Josh one more, at least one more. And again, it's hard to choose, which is, yeah, I would just ask for those who haven't had the benefit of reading your book, to say a bit about how you look at American Sniper and how Stuart Hall talks about media and ideology.
Yeah, thank you. So originally it wasn't like when I started writing the book, that wasn't in my, it wasn't planned, but then it started to come up in interviews that people would use it almost as like a, what they were compared against when they would meet people. Like, so it was like the operator culture. So for those that don't know, like an operator are usually like within special operations. So SEALs and Green Berets and, you know, on down the line, that those are the veterans that movies are made about. Those are the ones that get TV shows. It's not as exciting to watch a TV show perhaps about logistics or supply. And no offense to logisticians or supply people, it's stuff's really important, but like that doesn't necessarily make a sexy movie of kicking in doors. And so what happens is a guy had mentioned American Sniper by name, that he was having an interaction with a woman, and that was her frame of reference of what the war on terror was like. And he felt very, he didn't say othered, but that's the word I'm going to use, that his service was less than because he wasn't doing those things. So when Stuart Hall talks about media, he talks about this thing of encoding and decoding, so that pieces of culture, whether that's film or whatever, are encoded with ideologies like that. You can't escape that. But then on the other side, you can't control how people quote unquote read something. And so the way I was thinking about decoding was, how is it that American Sniper was received in American culture, that it became this like flagship of what the war on terror was. And so the movie by itself, it's whatever. I mean, it's basically a Western, you know, of good guys killing bad guys, you know, like that kind of a binary movie. But it was in the reception of how people talked about it. So when so Michael Moore and Seth Rogen both spoke out against the movie and about how in their mind snipers are cowards. Like that was the tweet. So then Michael Moore and Seth Rogen, the actor, they get bombarded with replies. You know, once again, I know Twitter is not the end all be all, but that how dare you speak against these heroes? How dare you? Like maybe you should go spend some time with Al Qaeda, and then we'll see who a coward really is. And it just struck me that the way we were talking about a film based on a book, you know, based on Chris Kyle's his life and his story, was completely removed from it as a product of like the cultural industry, as Stuart Hall would say. So how can we, so the third way that Stuart Hall talks about decoding is as opposition. So how can we, what I'm concerned with in the rest of the book is how do we live oppositionally? Like how do we not just accommodate dominant ideologies, but how do we live in opposition to that? Like how can we see what's really going on in discussions? How can we see what's really going on in these conversations, like with the national anthem debate? It's like, we're not really talking about veterans. We're talking about an inability to talk about police brutality for me. And so Stuart Hall helps me think about the way media encodes films and TV shows with what he calls dominant ideologies. So as a coming attraction to the book.
Thanks, Josh.
Thank you.
Gentlemen, thank you for a very rich conversation between the two of you, which also sparked a very lively and rich response in the chat. And I'm going to just start with at least ways that I don't know, responded to some of those questions. Sometimes you answered questions by the time the chat was finished, or you had addressed a question. But I wanted to. There's several things that came up for me that I wanted to pick up on, and particularly toward the end, one of the things that I wondered about was in the conversation you're having with one another, and that you find posed by this language about the good war or about moral injury. I wonder, is this more about theological anthropology, or is it more about the nature of the divine?
I was going to let the ethicist go first. You got an answer, Michael?
Could you restate that, Nancy?
Yeah, let me try to. It's clear that we're talking about the nature of human being. We're also talking about the assumptions that human beings have about some sort of order in the world, some sort of goodness, or the absence of it. And that's the reason why I asked, is it as much about theological anthropology, for example, and or is it more about the nature of whatever order, whatever power there is in this universe and in the world? That's I'm trying to avoid asking you about God, but how we imagine that kind of order.
Thanks. I got it. Josh, do you mind if I respond a little bit?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll just say in my own work, and I'll separate these two. I think it's both, Nancy, for me, it's both about, I mean, the human and divine are very...
Try to speak up a little bit, Michael.
Okay. So for me, it's both. I'm talking about humanity and the divine. For me, those are dependent on one another.
Yeah.
I draw on a couple people in a big way to flesh that out in my work. One is explicitly Christian. I use Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He's really compelling to say that Christ was not a principle, but a concrete person in relation with other persons. And by way of using him, I get into talk about Emmanuel Levinas, who's not a Christian, but a Jewish philosopher, ethicist. And he describes about what happens when one confronts the face of the other.
Right.
And that we could really go off in the weeds there. But
the kind of half opening that he mentions, for example.
Yeah. For me, both of those thinkers and others, but those are the two I use, talk about an encounter with the other that opens up an encounter with the divine. Right. To encounter the divine is to encounter the other in a genuine way, where the other confronts me in a way that's irresistible. I can't resist being changed by that encounter. So for me, that's what I'm trying to get at, as what can disrupt this sort of ideology that is locked into there's an enemy and we're in this movement toward eradication of the enemy. And for me, it's an encounter with the other, which is simultaneously an encounter with the divine.
Josh, you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, Bonhoeffer's another thing that we share together, but in different ways. Like I use a lot of his early work, you use some of the later stuff, but I think I want to say something different, although I agree with you. Like, I think it is both. Much of my own work is built around liberation theologies. And so how are we trying to remain in solidarity with things that I think the divine is in solidarity with? And so to say theological anthropology or God and the nature of things, it seems like for me, I hope the people I'm providing, the way I'm providing care is in a way that would be in solidarity with the way that the divine is loving them. So I join Michael. I think it's both. But a theology from below for me is, where I start.
I'm reflecting on the evidence that we have that fewer and fewer people in our culture, and certainly that would then enter the military, have any sense of affiliation with a particular religious tradition. And I'm thinking about Nancy Ammerman's research, now about 10 years old, that found that 80% of Americans had some moral guidance that was similar to love your neighbor as yourself. That was really their. They might not have had a particular religious tradition in the sense of Jewish or Christian or Muslim, for example, but they had held on to that notion. And if that were true, to the extent that that is true, then how might that be some resource for addressing the concern that each of you has made, that we have some obligation to the neighbor? Again, 80% of Americans at that time in her study demonstrated that.
I muted myself. I don't want to answer, but I want to prompt Josh.
Josh.
I watched you unmute yourself, so I was like, okay.
Well, that made me think of your book and how you talk about it's not a matter. Well, you said you can't leave ideology, but it's a question of sort of what ideology are we going to live in or reflect on. And it also made me think of when you use Stuart Hall, that this is a paraphrase for me. It's almost like he's saying, we don't have to talk about all this highfalutin stuff. Like, media directly influences culture and shapes it. So I say all that to say, I think you've got a better answer to that Nancy's question.
Could I add a layer?
No, Josh is going to respond, Rita, and then is that all right?
Oh, sure. I just have a layer to add into this that's even more complexifying, I think. But go ahead, Josh.
Okay. I think that that's helpful, Nancy, to think, especially as a caregiver, when I'm, as you all know, that as a chaplain, that we're not only providing care to, the Christians. For me as a UCC chaplain, my job would be close to non-existent because there's not many UCC practitioners that I know. But this commitment to being with everyone, to then say, if you're saying 80%, so 8 out of 10 that hold to love of neighbor as a resource to how we think about this, I think that's a natural engaging or jumping off point to how people can think differently about war and homecoming in the enemy, as Michael talks about. Like, if we can, we don't even have to necessarily use straight up Christian language or Buddhist language. I mean, it's in our humanity as neighbors. So I think that actually helps caregivers more than it hinders. So Rita, go ahead.
Oh yeah, the complexifying point is that I think it was in the spring of 2016 or 17, sometime in there. I was working with the Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health and helped them organize a symposium on moral injury for their faith-based partners. And so Brett Litz, who wrote the 2000, head lit author on the 2000, is a psychologist who's actually not at all interested in religion. He does not a religious person and doesn't think about religion.
Right.
And Bill Nash, who was a Navy psychiatrist and is also not particularly, he calls himself a humanist. He's also not that interested in religion. And then Jacques Verdouin, who runs a program for life sentence offenders in San Quentin prison, who's what he calls, he's a somatic psychologist who's a specialist in mindfulness. So somebody asked the question of them about sociopaths and people who are just evil. And Brett Litz flat out said, I think we're all born moral. And somebody said, what about sociopaths? He says, I've never met or worked with anyone who didn't have a conscience. And Bill Nash agreed with that. And Jacques talked about how his whole work is transforming violent offenders who are often in San Quentin for murder or life sentences. And they all agree that human beings are born moral. And this was not a theological claim. It was not a statement about theological anthropology. It was from their perspective as scientists who study neurobiology and neuroscience, that human beings are hardwired to be moral. And the people who wind up cynical and callous are the people you have to worry about a lot, because underneath the callousness is a kind of moral injury or something that broke them so early that they have no capacity or little capacity to recover. So I just think that raises some really interesting theological questions about the way we think about theological anthropology itself when we think about what constitutes human evil and negativity.
You know, Rita, I want to jump. I've heard you quote them before. And one of the things that strikes me is, I think better than moral would be that we're all born with the need to be loved, which is not the same thing, because we can also, as born to be moral, we can think about how children learn to be racist. We were born, I think a moral social development theory would say that we're all born with the need to be loved or to be in relationships that are trustworthy.
Right, but if our relationships that are trustworthy are racist, we become racist because
that's correct. So,
right?
It's the moral piece that
desire to the capacity to be loved rests on adapting to the meaning system into which one is born.
That's right. And so it's not necessarily moral, is my point.
Well, I don't know that it's possible to claim that there are actual meaning systems that are entirely evil. If there's love that's present at all and a person survives, even if they wind up deeply racist, there was some dimension of love that kept them alive.
And
right?
the need to be loved, I don't debate it. But the Rita's real question was to you all. I did want to introduce that.
I think it's an interesting thing coming from a whole direction that's not theological, and yet I think it raises some really serious questions about how we think about theological anthropology.
And
that takes the body seriously.
Go for it, Josh.
That's good. That's a good way to say it. I think it's spot on, and it fits within the trajectory of what we're talking about today, that there's a societal framework of the way we think about it. So when I think of those amazing examples you gave, I think about, and this isn't a surprise to either of you, but like the way we raise, from the school to prison pipelines or the prison industrial complex, the way that these things, yes, they take individual bodies, but if we aren't cognizant and willing to reckon and push back on the way these things emerge, that's not the right word, they grow in society, that or redlining, or the way that we do housing, the way we do healthcare. When I see these things, like who gets better care, if we're not willing to ask broader societal questions and we continue to do care in the same way, we can't be surprised that we're not going to get different results. So I think what you're saying is so spot on, like in the importance of a societal framework. So that's my first thought.
It's also, I also think it's true that there's no moral meaning system that doesn't have elements that are negative. Right. The part of the smugness of people who think that they're virtuous and other people aren't, is that they're unwilling to address the ambiguities in their own moral meaning systems. Right.
That's really well said, especially the smugness part. That's really well said. I agree with that.
Michael, do you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, just a bit. I very much appreciate all the work Bill Nash and Litz have done, and gravitated towards that early on, and now I find myself more drawn to Jonathan Shea again and his early work.
Yeah.
And also there's some tension there. But I think it gets at this question, well, his main point about betrayal of what's right is kind of this vague category that implies immorality. But I mean, he jumps into his first book he's comparing Vietnam veterans' experience with Greek tragedy. And his first example is that Achilles is betrayed by Agamemnon because Agamemnon seizes Achilles' war prize, who is the woman Briseis, takes ownership. And so I was always somewhat disappointed that Shea doesn't talk about that part. So Achilles is betrayed by Agamemnon. Like, that's what everybody thinks is what's right in that situation, is that Achilles gets Briseis. But what about Briseis and her betrayal? And that's how I think we're betrayed by a convention, a moral convention. And it's not to say, well, that was a moral framework. It's not to say, I don't think it's helpful to say, well, we could say that was immoral, but it was still a moral view, right? That was still a whole moral convention to which all these people subscribed at that time.
So, Michael, since you raised the point about a conversation forthcoming in your congregation about the flag, I wonder if you could share what your hunches are and what's at stake there. It might not be in a congregation, but clearly in this moment in our country, the issues that you would raise there are prominent in other contexts. What's at stake in, at least in a religiously shaped community, for raising the question that you're posing?
Well, there's some things at stake for me, and that
Well, yes, true.
I've become good friends with some of these people.
Yeah.
We've got an older congregation, so some of these folks served in the Korean conflict or very adjacent to World War II, and there's a lot of memory, a lot of views, a lot of nostalgia, and I don't want to rip this. I don't want to just roll right over how they see the world. But what is also at stake to me is that, and I reflect on, I'm reflecting on myself here. I'm already timid in raising this question about a piece of cloth. So what's at stake is if we can't have a conversation that doesn't hurt feelings about this flag, how can we be professional to think about empire and power and oppression? That's what's at stake for me.
Yeah, and how do you imagine that the Vietnam veterans in your congregation might hear your question?
That's a good question, because I'm not sure we have Vietnam veterans in my country. And I think there might be a reason for that.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think, yes, I think they would have a different point of view to add to the conversation.
Well, we did have an interesting observation from one of the attendees, Zachary Moon, about how your sense of the construction of American goodness also is part of the construction of moral dominance of the police and criminalization of Black and brown bodies, so that the othering that happens in order to have good wars or to have this sense of American moral enemies that Americans are moral in relationship to, which I think is part of what it's a symbolism of the flag is, how that relates to our own internal processes of which these paramilitary organizations then other and demonize internally, which is what we're seeing now, right? Which is what we're living with January 6th and other things. which has been really hard for people to face into.
I agree with that. And I'm glad you raised that, because that's what I was thinking about, Michael, when I brought up the ideology of war as it comes home. Is like veterans have said to me when they see, or when they saw Ferguson, they would say they have better equipment than we did in the early years of Iraq and Afghanistan. And so like the militarization, when those things roll, when those MRAP trucks roll into a community, to protect and serve is not necessarily the competencies of police departments, and it changes to be about violence, both explicit and implicit. So that's what I was getting. You worded that a lot better than I was trying to get at earlier. So thank you to both you and Zachary for that.
I lived in Oakland, California for 10 years, and I remember the controversy that erupted when the city of Berkeley, California, which we considered sort of Birkenstock granola left land, was considering buying a tank for its police department.
Holy crap.
And that this was a trend happening across the country, that the military was selling war machinery to cities and doing stagings. And they were doing stagings at the Oakland Coliseum every year called Operation Urban Shield, in which the Israeli military was coming in to teach domestic police departments how to do crowd control. And that there are things that our domestic police use, like tear gas, that are actually illegal in international warfare.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's been, I think, in the last 30 years, a rapid militarization of domestic paramilitary forces that starts to see everyone somehow, as the enemy.
Yeah.
Can I add a thought?
Yeah.
Real quickly, one thing I didn't say about my work, but which is a huge part of it, is Donald Rumsfeld. I found him to be a really engaging conversation partner. Not that I didn't have a conversation with him, but I learned a lot studying him. But there's an infamous quote. So there are folks in Iraq with Humvees that just had cloth doors and no doors. And he responded to the press saying, well, you go to war with the army you have, not the one you want. There's a lot of pushback about that. But in the wake of that, you see Homeland Defense money going everywhere in this country. And after I came back as an EOD tech in Arkansas, and you'd see these police departments in towns of 20,000 people would have a bomb squad truck, various machinery, because if they didn't spend the money wouldn't be there. So yeah, I think Rumsfeld, there's something about the way, I don't want to say I admire, but the way he would respond to things, even if it made the press angry, would eventually bring his goal about.
I'm going to thank you for bringing him back. You managed to work him in, and I'm glad you're continuing to spar with him. But I'm thinking about the folks on this webinar that are working with in VA centers and with active duty or reservists, and your skills, Josh, as an advisor or a spiritual care person. And I'm interested in your sense of what can be helpful for folks that these people are needing to stand beside. That's part of their work. When part of the pain that they carry is what you all have been lifting up today.
Yeah. Earlier, I sort of flippantly said, listen to stories. But I think what I've had to come to learn is that we're not always ready to share our stories, that it's a process, and then there's not the war story, they're like a war story, or and so like it's trying to build rapport and trust to be able to hear those stories at the pace when that person is ready. So I think there's a vulnerability on behalf of caregivers that like we would be the ones that would set that tempo to be vulnerable to knowing that the stories you might hear in a patient visit in the VA, or you might hear in your congregations, are gonna be upsetting But if you're the one that is able to hear that, I don't think it's too much of a leap to say that that's holy ground. Like that's when you've built trust and that there's a real relationship emerging. And also, when I say that, it feels very one-sided. Like we just wait for the veterans to share their stories. Like they're the one, like they're the identified patient. But I think the vulnerability has to be in sharing our own story as civilians or as caregivers, of like not understanding and not knowing the full scope of this, but being willing to hear it and being willing to share what war has meant to us, or for Michael, what war has meant, for your community of believers. That the act of deep listening and empathy and mutuality, like all that stuff you would hear like in an intro to pastoral care class. Right. So when you leave here today, review those notes. That's important.
One thing that one of the reasons why I've been eager for this more societal frame to emerge is precisely for that kind of opening, not only with veterans who struggle with those feelings in particular ways, but also to invite congregations who make Veterans Day a particular kind of event, if it's an event at all, to have religious leaders there who can frame it a bit differently and deepen reflection about how the larger populace is a part of the reality that Veterans Day represents. It strikes me that could be, Michael, one of the ways that one brings up a question about the flag. But I'm grateful for what you said, Josh, because it does suggest that there's vulnerability on both sides. But it will take a lot of skill. I'll be interested, Michael, to follow up on how you do raise this question when you do. But it does strike me that it's not just, it is important for chaplains to have this sensibility, not to presume what story they're going to hear. And so I'm grateful that you've mentioned that. It strikes me that it also invites us into a cultural conversation where religion has been woven into a certain mythology about war. So we're very close to the end. I want to give you two the last word.
There was one question for Michael. You want to tackle it, which is the ideological and moral difference or non-difference between World War II and the global war on terror.
I don't think 2 minutes is enough. Honestly, it's a great question, but
it's a great question.
I just, I don't want to take up. I think I'd go way over. I'll use 1 minute and give Josh the last minute to just. I always like to recommend books, and Josh recommends this one as well. Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried. Mm-hmm. Kevin Powers, The Yellow Birds, both fantastic fiction works. And then Nancy, something you said made me think of another one, but somebody mentioned Elizabeth Samet in the text.
I think this Samet's book is pretty interesting.
Yeah. This is a previous book of hers about teaching literature at West Point. It's also really raises cool questions, especially if you've read Shea. So it's a socialist part.
She does a good job, I think, of tackling that question about World War II as the good war in her book, Looking for the Good War.
That's my last word, Josh.
Josh, your turn.
Yeah. I think the thing I would say to conclude, which your last question got me thinking, Nancy, is anytime in veteran spaces we can disrupt one view of because you're right, we do hold a certain reverence for Veterans Day, Memorial Day, which is important. And I'm not saying to stop that, but we have to have these conversations throughout the year. And so trying to reclaim what it means to be a patriot, because right now that word means something very specific to a certain subset, but to push back and to ask questions about our military shouldn't be viewed as being like an outsider. We should be asking these questions as a society. And so to be able to reclaim that as a society, I think is an important place that we need to get back to if we were ever there in the first place.
Absolutely. So, gentlemen, thank you very much. And Rita, thanks for doing the chat and elaborating the questions. And thanks to all of you who've been a part of this. And I want to remind you that 10 days to 2 weeks, this webinar, this recording will be available to you, and along with the PowerPoints that were used. So thank you for being with us today, and thank you, Michael and Josh, for your leadership.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.